Interviewing and Oral Histories. My name is Shayna Plaut, and I am speaking from my home office in West Broadway, Treaty 1 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation. We all have many hats, and in this workshop, I'm going to be speaking as a journalist and a researcher. But right now, I'm speaking as the acting research manager for the Center for Human Rights Research. I'm also speaking as a mom who has two very small children home because there was a COVID outbreak at our daycare. My kids are fine. My kids are young. My kids might join our meeting. So just want to say thank you very much for coming. Please, folks, put your video on if you'd like. We'd like to know who is here. It makes us really excited to know that there are human beings and not just names. As you may know, this workshop is part of the Center for Human Rights Research Methods and Mediums series. It is a bi-monthly workshop that is focusing on the various ways to do and share human rights research. The first workshop that we had was a podcasting workshop in August. The next one that we're going to be having after this is working with journalists. That's going to be taking place on March 10th. At 7:30 p.m. And the last one that we're going to have is going to be in May. The date is still being finalized, but it's artistic methods in human rights. And if it's in person, it'll be an interactive workshop. We're really excited about these forthcoming workshops, and more information is available at the Center for Human Rights Research website. So please do check it out. And you can also be on our listserv and get inundated with lots of messages, including ones about that. So today's workshop, Spreading the Word, Statements, Interviewing, and Oral Histories, focuses on people's words, stories, memories, and verbal truths as they choose to share. We are honored to have Dr. Chantal Fiola, Distinguished Indigenous Scholar, Chair, and Associate Professor at the University of Winnipeg, who has agreed to moderate and facilitate today's discussion. Dr. Fiola is Michif, Red River Métis, and among other things, she's an author, a scholar, a recipient of numerous research grants, a mother, and a committed member of the Two-Spirited community here in Manitoba. I first met Chantal 3 years ago when we were working together on a community event, a vibrant and eclectic group of people coming together to create a public forum, Queer and Faithful. At the time, I was struck by her ability to create space for very different people to come together and learn from and with one another in a respectful, generative, and provocative way. I often hear Chantal being interviewed on CBC Manitoba, and I believe it is because of her skill at unearthing and discussing hard truths in a way that feels both nourishing and healthy, that we often will hear her voice. So it is a rare gift to also have her be able to create space to hear all of our voices. For all of these reasons and more, we're very grateful for Dr. Fiola has agreed to moderate this workshop, and I will now turn it over to you, Chantal.
Miigwech Shayna for that very generous introduction. Bonjour Nindinawe Maganidag, Zagate Kwe Indigenous, Bijune Dodem, Nin Nawe Nangwayabe, Bijig Mede, Onimupakosamoin Machifindao. So Shayna already let you know many things about me. So maybe I'll just, I wanted to add on to the land acknowledgement. Of course, we're encouraged to think of these as always works in progress and to think about how we personally relate to the territory on which we find ourselves. So I wanted to remind folks the panelists are gathered and speaking to you from the University of Manitoba, and the U of M and Winnipeg more broadly sources its water from Shoal Lake 40 and its hydro from Treaty 5 territory in northern Manitoba. I also like to remind folks that the province of Manitoba exists largely because of efforts from the local Métis population, and we were promised 1.4 million acres of land in and around Winnipeg in the 1870 Manitoba Act, but that is still outstanding. So this is a little bit, and my ancestors have script, dozens and dozens of Métis script in our family, but none of us, we don't know what happened to that land, and that's a common story. So that's a little bit of the way that I relate to our territory here. Miigwech, Shayna, for offering tobacco, which I'm carrying here. I'm honored to participate in this event. It sounds like a really exciting series as well. Just a couple housekeeping things. So I'm sure by now everybody's very familiar with the Zoom platform. So folks can keep their mics muted unless they're speaking. Like Shayna said, we encourage you to keep your videos on, but if you've got poor bandwidth or have little children at home because of COVID situation, of course you can turn your videos off. I'll ask folks to hold on to their questions. There will be 2 opportunities to ask questions. And at that point, folks will be welcome to either type their questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call upon you. So in terms of format, each speaker will be given about 8 to 10 minutes to share with us a bit about their work, their method of choice, and their projects. And then we'll have one of the opportunities to ask questions. And then there'll be a second round with the speakers, again, going for 8 to 10 minutes, this time focusing on tips and best practices while using their methods. And then we'll open it up for a final Q&A. So I will introduce the lovely panelists. I'll read out everybody's bio now, and then we can move right into the presentations. So Kaila Johnston, Ochapowace First Nation, is the Supervisor of Education Outreach and Public Programming at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. In this role, Kaila oversees matters related to the support of educators, development of resources, establishment of outreach initiatives, as well as public engagement on residential schools and their legacy. Prior to the NCTR, Kaila worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a statement gatherer and coordinator to support statement gathering initiatives. She holds a BA in criminal justice from the University of Winnipeg and a Master of Science in International Crimes and Criminology from Vrij University in Amsterdam. Shayna Plaut is a research manager for the Global Reporting Center and the acting manager of the Center for Human Rights Research. She has conducted an impressive 2,000 plus interviews in the past 25 years. And she likes to say that she's made just as many mistakes. Misha Falk is a recent graduate of the Queen's University Gender Studies program. During her undergrad, she worked with the Oral History Center at the University of Winnipeg to develop a project documenting transgender oral histories of the prairies. So miigwech to all the speakers for joining us, and to everybody for participating today. So we'll get started with the first round, and I'll invite Kaila to share a little bit about your work, projects, and your method of choice.
Hello to everyone who's come and attended. I just want to make sure everyone hears me nice and clearly. Getting some nodding heads, perfect. And I am just going to also make sure I check the time so I do not go over. Now, I guess as a little bit of additional history before I move into the statement gathering, I first joined the Truth Commission in 2010. I usually joke that I'm part of the first 25 guinea pig group. There are 25 statement gatherers who collected under Resolve here at the University of Manitoba, who were first trained prior to the 2010 first national event that was held here in Winnipeg in June of 2010. So we were given some kind of basic training, but I'll let you know from that 25 over the 5 years plus that 1 year extension. Out of that, it was just myself and one other statement gatherer named Barb Cameron, who survived is not the appropriate word, but who managed to stay with the commission for that full term. The other statement gatherers, and it's unfortunate when you take a look at the long number of statement gatherers, really only had that ability to hear maybe one statement or a few statements, and then understanding that was actually their limit when it came to taking statements from survivors during that TRC period. So with that, I was one of the first couple trained. And by the end of the TRC's mandate, there were a group of 15 to 20 of us who had joined throughout those years, who remained with the commission all the way to the end. But just as a little bit of a background information about the commission, they were allocated about $60 million to document the histories of survivors, of families and communities, and anyone really who were affected by the residential school system. And so their responsibility was to tell Canadians what happened, to honor the lives of former students and their families, and to create that permanent record. And so guiding them through that work, there were a number of principles, and I'll just name a few, as there's quite a few of them which helped guide their work, from being accessible and victim-centered, ensuring confidentiality. The big one was do no harm, but also taking into account accountability, openness, and honoring that process, being comprehensive, holistic, just and fair, as well as being voluntary and flexible. Now, within that work, there were 8 major components to the TRC's mandate. I'm really only going to be focusing on statement gathering, but just so you're aware of the other pieces, the TRC managed commemoration initiatives, regional liaison offices across Canada, which coordinated TRC efforts. There was the Missing Children and Unmarked Burial Project that worked to identify children, who they were, where they came from, where they might be buried, who went missing, and how they passed away. There were funds managed for community events, as well as the 7 national events held across Canada, meant to disseminate information, reach out to survivors, as well as educate the public. There was statement gathering activities, document collection, as well as the creation of the TRC's final report. So back in 2010, when I first joined as a statement gatherer, I also moved into coordinating statement gathering activities, as well as managing the equipment at the center. And part of that work was involved in recreating, or I should say, updating the manual that was done. It was created prior to that first national event and collected all the information needed to help support statement gatherers in the field. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those pieces and those kind of tips and tricks in that next part. But it's important to recognize that the TRC collected experiences, not only from former students, but from anyone who wanted to share. And it's an important reason why we use the terms statement provider and statement gatherer, rather than survivor or former student, knowing the whole community that would be involved in sharing those experiences. And it's also important why we use statement or experience rather than testimony. As when you think of the word testimony, often it carries with it this perception of being involved in the formal law process. And with the Truth Commission, they were not. So when people hear that word testimony, they might think of a law-based definition, such as giving a statement or a declaration under oath, which is not what that TRC was. The TRC could not compel individuals to give statements or attend events. It was completely voluntary. It was not an investigative body. It could not pass judgment on individuals, nor could it open investigations or request that governing bodies open up investigations. So when you take a look at the amount of statements gathered, in total, we were able to do 7,000 statements. But when you take a look at those submissions through the IAP process, also known as the independent assessment process, which was an out-of-court adjudication process to resolve claims of physical and sexual abuse and other wrongful acts, it really kind of is a drop in the bucket. So we have 7,000 with the TRC and about 38,000 with the IAP. And the reason why there's such a huge difference is for the fact that while both are voluntary, the TRC could not offer compensation during its work. As I mentioned, its focus was to gather those experiences from individuals to help inform the Canadian public and create that record. So for a lot of survivors, what we found is they had a very difficult decision they had to make. Either they had the strength to tell one story or one experience, and they could do it with the TRC or the IAP. And oftentimes they did go with the IAP because it could provide that compensation piece. And so it is the hope now, as our center continues to do work around statement gathering, that we will be able to collect more statements from those who are unable to share during the TRC's mandate. Now, just looking for my notes here. Just to share a little bit about our work at the NCTR so you get a sense of what we're doing now. After the TRC wrapped up its work, the NCTR opened its doors as in 2012, call for submissions was held for organizations to become the permanent host of what was then known as the Research Center. After a lengthy review process, the University of Manitoba was selected, and in 2013, a trustee and administrative agreement were signed. And in 2014, we moved into a temporary home, and that's when renovations began to our current home. So at this time, we hold all of the statements gathered by the Truth Commission, as well as the physical objects. So that's over 5 million records and counting, with about 59,000 available on our public database. We have an ongoing proactive release disclosure to ensure that we can release more and more of these records over time. Again, being guided by the principle, we cannot cause more harm than good by releasing this information, including the survivor statements that we gathered. So we have over 1,000 videos online, which includes statements from our public hearings, our sharing circles, as well as mini documentaries. So within our mandate, we are here first and foremost for survivors and families that they have access, for educators to share this history in the classroom, for researchers so they can dive deeper into those mysteries that exist. And the one I always highlight is Ian Mosby's 2013 article about nutritional experiments being done in residential schools. But the last two that I always connect very closely with each other, the public and the history, it's to ensure that we can help foster healing and reconciliation and ensure that this history and legacy are never forgotten. So I believe I have just a few minutes left before we pass things off. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a deeper explanation about the statement gathering process. So there were 3 means that statement providers could share statements, either one-on-one in a private setting, either in a sharing circle or a sharing panel. For sharing circles, that involved having 2 survivors, a moderator, and a circle of about 10 or so providers who had about 15 minutes to share their experience with the group. Within that, we recommended about 15 minutes for each person so they had time to share those experiences. And we did, because it was a public setting, discourage those from sharing names of perpetrators. Now, very similarly, there were statements that were given in front of 1 or all 3 of the commissioners through sharing panels. And so again, we had anywhere from about 1 to 15 statement providers go up to the sharing panel and share for about 15 minutes their experience. But I will let you know within our collection, we have statements as short as 5 minutes to as long as 40 minutes in both the circles and the panels. And again, these were done in very public settings with the use of banners, with the use of announcements, as well as rack cards. And my time is up, so I'm just going to share a little bit of the one-on-one statement gathering before I pass that on. So the one-on-one statement was done with the sharing, with the statement provider, the statement gatherer, as well as health support and any additional support. So this was done in a private room. This ranged in length from anywhere from 5 minutes to 10 hours in length, with that provider being able to share any part of their experience they wanted with us, which could then be recorded under 2 different forms of consent, either public or private. But I'll share a little bit more about that in the next section. So I'll wrap up now.
Miigwech, Kaila, thank you very much. I feel like we're just scratching the surface here with statement gathering, especially in such a significant undertaking. So people probably have lots of questions about some of the themes that you brought up around like confidentiality, flexibility, consent. So I'll ask folks again to keep their questions, and then you can ask them of Kaila and the others after the 2 presenters. Just a quick word. Apparently I have an unstable connection and I've gotten booted out twice here. We'll invite Shayna to come and share a bit about her work.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. And also just a reminder that this is being recorded, so just so that you know, and will be available on the CHRR website as well as the Robson Hall YouTube channel. So that will be there. Chantal, I am a firm believer of technology gremlins. So if you get booted out, I'm happy to fill up the time and the air and do the weaving until you come back in. Once again, I want to say thank you very much to everybody who's here, to our special guests, as well as to our, well, all of us are special guests. So to our special guests that are spotlighted and to our special guests who are involved here. I am Dr. Shayna Plaut in terms of academic sense, but I am also a journalist, and I have been. I started my first newspaper when I was 9.5 years old. It was called the Ace Reporter. And then I first started my first underground zine that went international when I was 15. And I also started working for my city's newspaper at that time. I've never done daily reporting, and I want to be very clear about that because it's a different kind of journalism. I've done more long form feature, which means that I often have the time and the space to be able to reach out to people, as well as to people who are hard to get to. And this is important when I'm talking about doing interviewing. But I am also an academic, and I choose to use semi-structured interviewing as one of my main forms of data collection, which is a really, scientific and harsh sounding term, but it is a term that we use in academia when you're collecting data from and people's stories end up becoming data in this sense. And then there's the collecting of the data, and then there's the analysis and the synthesis of the data. So semi-structured interviewing is the technique that I tend to use quite a bit. And then I triangulate that with archives, with participant observation, et cetera. But I always go back to the interviewing. The reason why I'm saying this is that I'm going to explain a little bit in terms of my own experience of doing interviews. And I will at times distinguish harshly between journalistic interviewing and academic interviewing. And what I'm saying there is the archetypes, the structures that are set up there. It doesn't mean that that things don't get blurred. It doesn't mean that it doesn't spill over, but I'm going to be kind of presenting it in that archetypal way. But let me start with the first person that I actually interviewed. The first person I actually interviewed was my grandma Betty, and she was 10 years old, and I was in Hebrew school, and we had an assignment that we needed to do regarding the Holocaust. And my mom said, "Well, why don't you speak with Grandma Betty?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I knew Grandma Betty was from Germany because she had this very thick accent, even though she claimed I was the one with the accent. But I didn't really know anything in terms of this part of the experience. And so I asked my grandma if I could interview her about her experiences with the Holocaust. And she paused for a really long time. And then she said, "Okay, Shayna, if you want me to talk, I'll talk." And she did, but she also cried a lot. And it was really, really, really hard for her to talk, but she also really wanted to talk. And I realized at that point also, and I was recording, that the reason why my mom had suggested that I was the one to interview Grandma about this was, one, so that I would hear some of the stories, but two, I might have been one of the only people that Grandma would talk to because I was 10 years old and because I was her granddaughter. So it also taught me to listen. And it taught me that an interview isn't just the person asking questions or the person answering the questions, but that an interview is that co-constructive process of going back and forth and creating information and creating knowledge. And that it really depends a lot on the context of how those interviews are taking place. Who's doing the questioning? Where is the questioning taking place? What is the relationship with those people? What is the purpose of asking these questions? Where is that going to be going? And how much comfort also does that person have in the way that they're speaking? And how are they speaking in that time? Given that we have so many different hats, what hat is doing that speaking. And so the same person can be interviewed by different people and you're going to get very different knowledge. And this was, something that I carried with me. And I carry that actually both in my journalistic interviewing as well as in my academic interviewing. That said, if I'm to be horribly, again, just boxed in when I'm talking about journalistic interviewing, one of some of the characteristics of it is that there tends to be an air of skepticism. The person who is doing, the journalist who's doing the interviewing is looking for holes, looking for things that aren't there, pushing, provoking, trying to get more. There's an air of skepticism between the interviewer and their quote unquote source. There's also an air of ownership that the journalist often thinks that this is my story. I own this story. This is, and these are my sources from my story. Now, this has been challenged somewhat. This has been pushed back somewhat. There's a piece that I wrote with my colleague, Peter Klein, regarding fixers and this kind of a narcissism that often can come with journalists. And there has been a bit of pushback, but that still is, an unfortunate but true idea. The journalist is going to get their story and they're going to feel that ownership to it. What that means is there also tends to be a protection of the story and a protection of the sources. And it is a rare journalist that will share their questions with the interviewees beforehand. Because one of the things is there's an idea that you want to catch somebody off guard. You don't want them to prep for you. You want to get, quote unquote, the truth. And we can, of course, problematize this in terms of positivist notions of truth, but that does tend to be the starting point. Semi-structured academic interview, which is what I also do, again, goes back to that notion of a co-construction of stories and a co-construction of knowledge. So in between the interviewer and the interviewee, the knowledge is being created. One of the things, at least in the practices that I do, is I always share my questions beforehand. I also share my transcripts afterwards with the people. And I always say, if I've misunderstood or misrepresented anything that you said, please, make those changes. This is your truths. This is what this is gonna, how I understood what you said, but make it so that it makes the most sense for you at this point in time. I also always tell people, where is this going? I'm doing this interview, but for what purpose? Where is this going? That will also often shape how people choose to edit it. So I ask people, please speak whatever you want to speak now. You'll have a chance to look at the interview afterwards and then edit it afterwards. So edit later, in that sense. I also always give people the option of a default towards confidentiality, but give people the option of having their name used. This is different than in journalistic interviewing, where you always are going to have somebody's name used unless they have a really strong reason of why they want to be confidential. So that's also the distinction. Lastly, with academic interviewing, people always have the option to pull out. So when you're inviting people in order to do the interview, you let them know they can pull it out at any time. When you start the actual interview, you let people know that they can pull out any time. When you end the interview, you let them know they can pull it out any time. And even after they read the transcript, they can also pull out at any time. So all of these interviews, both journalistic and academic, like I said, I've done about 2,000 interviews over about 30 years and made just as many mistakes. I've interviewed through interpreters, where people are, I'm interviewing them in English or other languages, and they're speaking back, and there's an interpreter in between. I've interviewed people where I've been speaking my second or third language, where they've been speaking their second or third language. I've interviewed people in post-conflict war zones, and I've interviewed folks, for radio, for long-form print journalism, for my dissertation. I love interviewing, honestly, and later on when we speak, I'll share some of my tips, and I call it tips and tricks, but it's tips and best practices, in terms of interviewing, based on just things that I've learned. So thank you very much.
Miigwech, Shayna. It's really interesting to hear some of the differences in discipline, like between journalism and academia. It almost sounds like you're trying to trick people when you're in the world of journalism. But you raise some really important things for us to consider, in particular around like what's the purpose of the story, or why are you trying to speak to people, considering things around like language barriers, or if, you know, sensitivity or great care needs to be taken if we're working with vulnerable populations. So thank you for that. We've got Misha is up next, and then we'll invite some questions. So the floor is yours, Misha.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to quickly share my screen as I have a little PowerPoint for you. Here we go. So just, I guess, thinking about these last two wonderful talks that we've just heard, I'm pretty new to doing oral history work myself. In my presentation, I've only really done one fairly small project. So I'm going to kind of take you through some of the development and the steps that went into kind of conceptualizing the sort of project, the different supports I received and sought out, and kind of how I brought this all together. Sorry, this is skip forward a bit. So I began the Transgender Oral History Project in 2019 when I was still in my undergrad at the University of Winnipeg. This project emerged kind of through a number of different kind of influences and inspirations. At the time, I was working as a research assistant for the Museum Queries project. I'd been encouraged by my supervisors there to explore if there's any resources on transgender history in Manitoba. As part of this, I ended up spending a lot of time researching at the Manitoba Gay and Lesbian Archives at the University of Manitoba, and also kind of flipping through old copies of Swerve, Winnipeg's now defunct local LGBTQ magazine. However, I didn't really find a lot of information about trans histories. The only thing I really found was in the archives. There was several Miss Lonely Hearts advice columns from the early 90s, wherein, you know, anonymous concerned suburban women wrote in about what to do about their husbands who they had discovered were secretly cross-dressing. And this kind of, fun as this sort of was, it really didn't give me a whole lot to go on and didn't give me a lot of leads into what transgender people's own experiences were like. So thinking about kind of these gaps in the record, another source for my project was my reading of Valerie Kornick's 2018 book, Prairie Fairies, A History of Queer Communities and People in Western Canada, 1930 to 1985. I learned a great deal from Kornick's book and found it to be a really useful compilation of a lot of different queer histories that I had previously heard or read about, as well as a lot of new information. However, I was pretty disappointed to find that there was only a single 2-page subheading on transgender people. And basically this subheading just said that, you know, trans people weren't the focus of Kornick's study, and there were very few existing resources on the topic, so it just wasn't the book wasn't going to explore it in depth. So rather than taking this as a disappointment or a setback in my research, I instead saw it as maybe a bit of an invitation to look into this kind of question why this gap existed and maybe do some research into that myself. Between my visits to the archives and my reading of Prairie Fairies, I realized that the problem with trans history on the prairies went a little bit deeper, as there seemed to be a general lack of information and archived material available to me. I had originally planned to do some sort of analysis of trans history as a sort of addition or response to the work in Kornick's book. But given the lack of resources, I began to explore the idea of doing an oral history project to kind of get some records and hear people's own experiences and see if that might kind of illuminate some things for me. The third spark for beginning this project was my own experience transitioning, which I had begun about 1.5 years before the beginning of this project. Although I had a couple of friends who were about at the same point in their gender transitions as myself, I felt very disconnected from any sense of community and was extremely curious about the experiences of trans people, particularly in generations above me, who lived close to my local context. I had heard about other projects such as the New York City Trans Oral History Project and had read extensively about the lives of other trans people, both historically and in the present, but I had a very few people in my own context to either kind of learn about or talk to, and this kind of set some of the initial inspiration for doing an oral history project. So really, this project comes out of three different origin points or starting off points. My work with museum queries, my kind of noticing of the gaps in Valerie Kornick's book, and my own desire to find other people, other trans people in my own context to connect with and talk to and learn from. So this led me into kind of the development and conceptualization of the project. After I had laid this initial groundwork and explored what resources were available to me, I landed on the idea of doing a long form oral history work with by interviewing other trans people. My thought was this project might be eventually added to the archives like the Manitoba Gay and Lesbian Archives to help inform future historical work for whoever's writing the follow-up to Prairie Fairies or doing further academic scholarship on that. I pitched this project first to my supervisors at Museum Queries, and with their mentorship, began to put together my ethics review and identified what steps I would need to take in order to turn these ideas into a reality. I had done some work, with student newspapers and had initially begun my undergrad in media and communication studies. So the idea of interviewing people was a little bit familiar to me. However, oral history work is really outside of what I had ever tried and done before. So I was very aware going into this project that I was going to need to get some training and really kind of learn from people who are more experienced in doing the methods and practices of oral history work. And for this, I was told by my supervisors to, or suggested to reach out to the Oral History Center at the University of Winnipeg and to see if there's any courses or training that I could take with them. To my delight, I found that the Oral History Center was really, really supportive and helpful in my process of figuring out what I was doing. The Oral History Center directed me to a full-day workshop on conducting oral histories that they were hosting. In meetings, different people at the center helped me talk through some of the scope and framing of my project, and also pointed me in the direction of grant funding for which I successfully applied. And the Oral History Center eventually has become the place that currently houses the completed interviews, transcripts, and data associated with the project. So planning the interviews, I contacted my interviewees mostly through community connections, emailing people I thought might have leads for me, who then put me in touch with potential interviewees. I also advertised the project through Rainbow Resource Center and through a small community newsletter. I received a fair bit of interest right away. However, one of the main challenges to finding interviewees for the project was people's level of comfort going on the record, talking about their experiences. For example, I went through the process of contacting and talking with 3 different people who were all very interested in and supportive of the project, but who themselves were either not out to family or their workplaces, or else just felt like their personal history was a little too heavy to talk about on the record, which is very understandable. One major takeaway from this project was that each interviewee expressed a desire to feel more part of a sense of community with other trans people. And this gave me a sense that many other people maybe were in similar situations to myself, trying to find other people and hear their experiences and connect. And in one case, this actually led to an interviewee and I kind of developing an ongoing friendship, which led us to hosting a series of dinners before the pandemic with other trans people, which felt like a really important kind of moment of connection to come out of doing this project. So just wrapping up, talking about the future of this project, I put this project on hiatus when I went off to pursue my master's degree. Between school and the pandemic, I've not really had a lot of time to put much thought into the project after the initial cluster of 7 interviews, 5 of which are kind of fully completed. If I were to return to the project, I think I would need to seek out a collaborating partner or otherwise open it up in some way to get other people involved. And while the Oral History of Center at the U of W is a really excellent space for the long-term archiving of these interviews for future researchers, I hope to eventually maybe explore some ideas of how I could develop a platform that is a bit more easily accessible for community members to see the archives and get involved with the project or reach out to me, as archives can be a little bit intimidating for people. This might also look like kind of putting the project out a bit more visibly, or making it easier for people to connect and reach out and find this project, since right now that I haven't kind of made it most publicly available, I guess. So I'm still looking for future possibilities for what this project might kind of turn into. It's very much the first stage of it is done, but I think there's more to be explored, and I'm really thankful to have this opportunity to kind of share what I've done with it so far. And yeah, I'm happy to answer more questions or talk about it during the question period. But that is all for now.
Thank you so much for sharing a little training before we enter the field, before we start speaking with people, the importance of community connections, the beautiful possibility of having ongoing relationships with folks that we meet, and also some of the challenges around like lack of resources. And I know you mentioned that Coronet book, and being disappointed that basically the trans community wasn't part of Coronet's focus. And I was also similarly disappointed to learn that queer Indigenous peoples were not part of Coronet's focus either. But then we have the opportunity to use these methods to try to fill in some of those gaps. So I'm looking at the time here, and I think we might have been a little bit ambitious with trying to do 2 full rounds of 10 minutes per speaker. So I'm wondering if it might make Q&A and involve the rest of the folks in the room. Any objections to that?
Mine cut out, so I only heard half.
Oh,
half,
no.
Were we cutting the second portion and just going into Q&A?
Chantal, you might want to turn off your video because the bandwidth is a little bit too low.
Well, I was going to say, here, let me stop my video. Okay, so I've done that. Sorry, folks, this hasn't happened before. But yeah, my suggestion, just looking at the time here, was to invite the 3 speakers back just for a couple minutes to talk about some of their favorite tips and tricks and best practices. And then we can conclude with like a longer Q&A and involve the rest of the folks in the room. So we'll circle back to Kaila.
Perfect. All right, sounds good. I'll try and keep it less than 5 minutes. Some pieces I'll pick out. So within the statement gathering process for the TRC, we had a workflow kind of as follows. Whether it was one-on-one statements or panels or circles, each one had a registration desk. The provider would do registration, connect with the health support. They would then be welcomed into the room by the statement gatherer, do consent, equipment, record that statement, burn that CD or DVD, and then exit with the healthcare. So for us, setting the tone was very important. For those providers, they needed to know this was a safe, a positive process that was built on trust and respect. And how that can be started is knowledge of the community. So building that trust and rapport with first contact. So finding that balance between formal and informal processes, and stressing, compassion, warmth, and kindness. So it's good to have knowledge of the community, their history, culture, and being able to work in the cultural and political protocols. And then really connected to that for the TRC is health support. So again, highlighting do no harm. We had Health Canada, Resolution Health Support Workers, every step of the way for that statement provider, before, during, and after giving their statement. They worked closely with them to ensure that if they were triggered by talking about their experience, or if a critical incident or something occurred, that they would take over on behalf of the statement gatherer, as the statement gatherer wouldn't be trained in some of those necessary skills needed to help de-escalate certain heavy situations. But for us, having health support was not only there for the provider, but the gatherer. They're there for you as well. And so it was very important that we stress self-care as well as debrief sessions. So if you're doing these group gathering events, having a pre-debrief session in the beginning as well as afterwards to talk about some of the statements or experiences that were had, to be on the aware of any concerns is also so very important, as well as to talk about vicarious trauma, that risk of potentially carrying the trauma of the stories or experiences you heard with you. So being aware of any physical or emotional changes. And then if you're gathering statements or gathering these oral histories, being prepared for that before and after. So if you know exercise helps you with stress, say doing a run or yoga or exercise afterwards once you've had that time. So you're not carrying those emotions or those negative experiences with you. And then, the last little piece I'll kind of touch upon is, setting up that physical space and emotional space. So being away from loud noises and distractions, being free of clutter, having unblocked accesses to doors and exits, having access to foods, waters, tissues, ensuring that you're grounded when you begin those statements, as again, you don't want to be carrying any sort of stressors or other pieces with you into that statement. As a statement gatherer, you're there as a listener, not as an interviewee. So we really allowed the statement provider to kind of guide or drive that session. And again, as kind of mentioned earlier, we go through two different consent options. We talk about being able to withdraw their statement at any time, change that level of consent as well as at any time, and being really open into future contact if they would like to make any of those changes in the future, to ensure that any family that wants access has the ability to do so. But with that, with short time, I'm going to pass things on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kaila, for those that specific list of things that folks can consider in their efforts. I will pass it right along to Shayna.
Hello, folks. Sorry, Malik made a little cameo there, but now we're all good. Everyone's had their lunch. So a couple of things. I just want to just go back on something that was mentioned a little bit earlier about, and where I'm making a distinction between journalism and interviewing, academic interviewing, and then I'm going to give my own tips and tricks. I don't necessarily know if journalism is trying to trick the interviewee, as rather as that journalism is this idea of it, you're going to be finding the truth. So again, there's this notion, and very problematic, a positivist idea of the truth, that there's one truth that's out there and you're going to go finding it. Whereas I would say that with academic interviewing, at least the approach that I take is that it's creating knowledge, right? So you're creating truths, in that sense. So I would say that that's just, almost a completely different epistemological standpoint. I never thought I would say epistemological standpoints. I am so sorry. That was really over academic, but just from where you're starting from. That said, I would say that I view an interview very much as like a river. You're never going to step in the same river twice. You're never going to have the same interview twice. Whether it's journalistic or whether it's academic, it's just not going to happen. So I'm going to share my screen here. When I'm teaching, I always try and have some sort of an interview assignment that I have my students do. And these are both graduate students as well as undergraduate students, and often students who've never ever had an opportunity to interview somebody before. But many of them have been interviewed, right? We've gone through job interviews. We've done that. So one of the things I start with is, how do you locate people? You start with who you know and who they know. Recognize the immense diversity of networks that we have already. whether it's through babysitting, whether it's through going through your favorite store, whether it's your neighbor, whether it's your mom's, best friend, whatever it might be, right? Start with who you know and who they know. Again, for academic interviews, I always say give people 2-week notice. This might be your assignment, and it's like a really huge deal for you, and you are one of many things on people's to-do lists or easily dismissed emails. So try and give people 2-week notice. If somebody does agree to being interviewed, ask where they want to be interviewed, what location, similar to what Kaila is saying, is going to be, comfortable for them. Remind them that ask them how they want to be identified. I know I keep going back to people have multiple hats, but one of the most interesting interviews I ever did was with somebody who is the head of a migrant rights organization in the UK, who is originally from Bosnia, who's a survivor of rape, who had been a refugee, and who's also a journalist. And I remember I was interviewing her as somebody who really uses journalism as a form of advocacy and migrant-led and refugee-led advocacy. And she looked at me and she said, "I just want to know when I can stop being a refugee." And this is, this is where it's like people have many, many hats, but how do they want to be known in this time? I am seeing that I'm slightly out of time. So I will just say, remind them it's totally voluntary, as I'd already said, offer for it to be confidential, write out the questions before that you have, and keep them with you as a guide. If you're recording, still take notes, and always send the paper afterwards. And also, if you're going to be meeting at a coffee shop or something like that, offer somebody something to eat, drink, some sort of coffee in that sense. And remember, shorter questions are better. Any terminology that they use, any names that they say, any dates that they say, ask them to spell it for you, make sure that you have it right, etc. Remember, again, they are sharing their truths with you, and you need to also be showing that kind of respect as well, and the humility that comes with it. Thank you very much.
Miigwech, Shayna. We'll move right into the final speaker, Misha.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, again, kind of coming at this from a very, being fairly new to doing oral history work, I just have some sort of reflections on and kind of learning moments from my own putting together of this this project, and they might not be kind of totally applicable to every kind of project out there, but some kind of my own reflections from my work that I will offer. And I guess the biggest kind of tip I can give or kind of take away from my own work is that kind of if you're interested in doing oral history or interviewing people, reaching out and kind of asking questions is super important. When I got the idea for the Trans Oral History Project, I really had no idea how I was going to get started with it. And getting in touch with people like people at the Oral History Center was a really huge support for learning the technical aspects of oral history work, as well as kind of workshopping the framing and kind of conceptualization of what I was doing. And if you have an idea for a project that you're excited about, there are probably other people out there who are also going to be excited about it just as much as you. And having those people to bounce ideas off of can be huge for turning your ideas into a tangible working project. And yeah, as an introverted person myself, reaching out can often feel like the hardest part of the whole process, but it can really feel rewarding to make those connections and see other people kind of get excited about your ideas and open up what might be possible out of it. So my next tip, kind of related to the first, would be to, at least in my own context of creating a project and having to frame it, would be to kind of have other people to work with and to talk about what you're doing with. I started my project in a really solo way, kind of just on my own, and I found that limited me in some different ways. This kind of changed partway through the project. When I got the grant money, I used some of that to use most of it really to pay a friend of mine to help me with some of the transcription work. And in retrospect, I think I couldn't have really done this project without that. You know, the labor of transcribing is pretty significant, and having someone to help me with that was huge. But also, along with just sharing the labor of it, having another person who also was listening to the interviews and seeing kind of the project at this stage where it wasn't really public yet, but I was still, you know, had just done a couple interviews and was transcribing them, was really important. My friend and I spent some time like discussing different things that came up in the interviews, and this helped me get a really kind of give me the confidence that this project was, you know, actually interesting to people other than myself. And you know, I learned so much from my interviewees, but it felt like kind of experiencing the conversations in a kind of new way when I was discussing them with another person who was also kind of engaging with them and asking questions and curious about what had come up. And seeing what they kind of saw in our conversations. So, and definitely if I'm going to continue this project, which I hope I will, I very much want to kind of possibly kind of create, get other collaborating partners involved and maybe kind of make this project not just sort of my kind of pet project, but have it be something that develops in relation with other people and has that sort of input. I realized is probably the biggest kind of takeaway for myself. Another major learning point was to not let the structure of what I'm doing kind of become inflexible. In the ethics review, I found that to be a very intimidating process. I'd never done anything like it before. And once my ethics were signed off on, part of me felt like I could no longer change any aspect of what I was doing or modify like the questions in any way. And that kind of made me feel a bit tense going into the first few interviews, being like, I don't know, I said I can ask these questions, but like, what if a follow-up question comes up? Am I allowed to ask that? And so just letting myself be a bit, this let me like be a bit more led by the interview structure rather than by the interviewee. And I guess switching over to like having the conversation go where the interviewee wants to take it and following them and responding to them felt a bit more kind of important than just sticking to exactly what I had set out. So that was sort of a big moment for me as well, learning how to follow the interviewee in the process. And again, this is something I kind of keep coming back to, but just having, allowing the sort of connections that happen in the interview process, having those kind of able to develop in whatever way they will. It was important, even if they don't, you know, if the interviewee isn't really interested in staying in contact or staying a part of the project, that's okay. But if they are interested, allowing that to kind of develop further and allowing them to kind of stay in touch with you and hear about the project. And if community does kind of come out of that, that can be a really wonderful thing. I guess staying open to that aspect of doing this work was definitely something that I didn't necessarily expect going into it, and I'm really glad to have found. So that's about kind of all I have for my tips and best practices. I just want to thank Shayna again so much for inviting me to be a part of this, and also to thank the other panelist, Kaila Johnston. Thank you so much, and thank you so much to Chantal for moderating for us today.
You bet, Misha. Thank you so much. So my apologies for kind of rushing through here. I must have written the time down wrong on my calendar here, but so we've got lots of time for questions and answers. So if there's anything that any of the speakers mentioned that you're curious about hearing more about, or you've got questions based on your own experiences, we've got a wealth of knowledge here in the room. In particular, with regards to working with vulnerable communities and the challenges of balancing, you know, putting the needs of the participants and the community members first and foremost, but then ensuring that you're still meeting the needs of your institution or wherever you're working from. And also issues around whether we ourselves are members of that community. You know, once the project is done, we don't leave our community, right? This isn't about extractive research. We will forever be part of the community. So what does that look like? Okay, so if folks want to either type a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call upon you. So maybe if folks are feeling a bit shy, we can, I can ask the first question to get us started. So basically along the lines of what I just mentioned, can any of the speakers discuss a bit about what you've found to be particularly important when working with vulnerable communities? How have you developed your own practice around this? Shayna?
Yeah, I can start. And I mean, part of it is I personally have a hard time with the term vulnerable populations or vulnerable communities. I feel like we're all vulnerable and we're all strong in various times. That said, if we're talking about like folks, you know, in terms of power imbalances, and in terms of like, you know, that aspect, then I would say that I think one of the main things is I don't want to say giving over some of the power, but you know, sharing some of the power. And in times it also means giving over some of the power. So I often do what's called interviewing up. I'll interview people who are in positions of power. I'll interview people, you know, in that sense. And they're, you know, but I also will interview folks who might be survivors of torture, or who, you know, may, you know, maybe refugees, and one of the things is that I think it is not looking at these folks as victims, or not looking at these folks in terms of needing of my protection, but rather you know, that they are choosing to want to share some of their story so that they can speak their truth, in this sense. And again, whether it's for a journalistic piece, or whether it's for you know, an academic piece. Similarly to Misha, I stay in touch with folks. I always give my number. My cell phone number is very public. My home number is very private, but my cell phone number is very public. I always email the transcript afterwards. I always ask folks to please edit it. I always ask folks to choose where they want to be interviewed. I always send the final product afterwards. And one of the main ways that I usually ask folks even to participate is I'm like, people do a lot of talking about you. They do a lot of talking about sex workers. They do a lot of talking about refugees. They do a lot of talking about folks in jail. They do a lot of talking about, you know, folks who might use drugs, or be part of the foster care system. All these populations that may be quote unquote deemed as vulnerable. I often say, people do a lot of talking about you. What would you like us to know? And I think that's the way I try and reframe it in that sense.
Great. Miigwech for that reminder to be careful of like the terminology and the wording that we're using, because of course we don't want to like strip folks of their agency. And on the other hand, remaining conscious of the fact that, you know, harm has been done to our communities, many communities, like at the hands of our institutions. And of course, we don't want to participate in that because it's ongoing in some cases. And so that reminds me of one of the things Kaila said at the beginning about do no harm. Kaila, did you want to chime in?
I do. I pulled some stuff that I wasn't able to share earlier. So just a reminder that knowledge of that community, knowing that history they've had with previous researchers or institutions or organizations will help in getting kind of a base groundwork as to what sort of challenges you may experience with participation or that lack of trust. When it comes to that process of gathering that statement, it was that welcome. So with the registration paperwork, learning their names, getting a sense of who they are, learning those health support workers that are there, you're there to make them comfortable in that welcoming. It's that atmosphere, it's that calmness that you bring, that they can trust you through this process. It's walking them through. Do they have questions at any point in time? Do they feel comfortable with the equipment? Do they need more space? What are those options that they have available? And just, having that reminder that they can do various consent options. They have those rights to withdraw or add to their statement. Through our process, we didn't really have questions. The statement provider had full reign. If they did have some difficulty on where to start or what to talk about, we had some set of kind of guiding questions, such as, what was your first day at residential school like? Prepared, but otherwise giving them that full reign to talk about whatever they wished. And then kind of the other piece I'll share with the tips and best practices is being aware of your body language. So avoiding closed body language like crossed arms, being aware of facial expressions, be just conscious, especially if you are working with individuals who've had traumatic pasts. It's fully natural to be shocked or, have, reservations about hearing those. But again, the focus is on that statement provider and not yourself. You do have that time to debrief after. So again, just engaging in active listening, showing nonverbal cues that you are listening, nodding the head, that eye contact, hand gestures, and really kind of feeling how that interview, that statement is going. Get a sense of what sort of reactions they are looking for, because some may be uncomfortable with that complete silence. They may be looking for more verbal reactions, for instance. So it's being aware of the surroundings, being aware of how you're feeling and how that statement provider is feeling as well, to get a sense of kind of where you might need additional assistance or if you need to take breaks. It's just kind of being in tune as to what's happening.
Miigwech, Kaila. I think Shayna wants to jump in really quickly about body language.
Thank you so much for saying that, Kaila. That's so true. And one of the things, and it's a really simple thing I know that I try and do, I'm old school, and we're not going to talk about my flip phone, which is already a problem, but I also take notes using notepads. And I always am taking notes when I'm interviewing folks. And I always let people know at the beginning that I'm going to take notes because it helps me remember, but it also makes sure that I'm getting things right and that I can go over it again with them. And I always put the notepad on top of the table as opposed to on my lap or underneath the table, especially, just so that folks, anybody who may have had an experience in institutions knows what it's like to have a doctor or a warden or somebody like that writing notes about you and not sharing it. So it's always on the table so that folks can see what I'm writing. And that's exactly for one of those reasons. So thank you for.
Thanks, Shayna. Misha, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, I had some kind of thoughts in response to your question. Just specifically, in my work interviewing other trans people, and I think this could be applied to many other different kinds of people as well, but for trans people, one thing that I was really aware of and trying to kind of wrestle with in this project was, we are often kind of told to tell very specific kinds of narratives or like frame our experiences in very specific kinds of ways to doctors and psychologists and whatnot so that we can get healthcare, because otherwise, often if our narrative doesn't kind of fit the sort of mold that the DSM says it needs to fit, we might be kind of barred from accessing care in different kinds of ways. And that's a real sort of issue, and kind of it kind of is complicated because we have to tell our life story or our narratives to institutions in particular kinds of ways that then sometimes kind of shapes the words in which we're able to frame our experiences through. So when I'm in a situation talking to another trans person, it's almost like there's sort of a double narrative happening where we're in a way I'm kind of curious about, like, yeah, how do we frame ourselves to various institutions we interact with, and then what do you feel about that? Like, does that fit? Maybe that is totally what fits some people, but also it often isn't. And then kind of what happens, what are the sort of multiple narratives that we end up telling about ourselves to different kinds of people in different kinds of contexts? And that's something I'm always really curious about when I'm interviewing people of like, how are we sort of narrating ourselves in different kinds of ways to different people? And that's a difficult thing when you're sort of trying to interview a person and you're asking them to sort of do that active confessing or telling their truth or something, sometimes you can kind of default to that that narrative that you kind of have been told you need to tell about yourself. But sometimes it's like, how do you kind of get to a place of being able to explore that as itself being a bit of a complicated thing? And I think definitely for not trying to press and say like, oh, there's one narrative, but I know it's more complicated. Tell me a different one. I'm not interested in doing that at all. But I think definitely for doing an interview where there's some sort of a kind of shared experience, or even if there's not a shared experience, if there's like a shared kind of openness to like, there's no sort of stakes in this, it's you can kind of say whatever you want about your experience and yourself. We can kind of explore some of those questions in a bit of an interesting and kind of complicated way. At least that's sort of part of what I, if that's where an interviewee wants to kind of go with a conversation, I'm always sort of interested in exploring the ways we're kind of shaped by the narratives we're expected to tell about ourselves and that kind of thing.
Well, miigwech for your robust responses, everybody. We do have a question in the chat from Miranda. In the spirit of reciprocity, what are some examples of how you can honor, appreciate, compensate those who share in a meaningful way to avoid extraction? Any of the panelists care to share their thoughts?
I wasn't sure who might go first, so I'll just have some quick comments since the TRC was a little bit of a different process. What I'll share is when it came to offering items to providers during the session, the TRC generally offered tobacco. But as we are moving away and we're evolving at the NCTR, it's really important to get a sense of what's appropriate for that specific community you're working with. So for instance, tobacco isn't necessarily appropriate for other Indigenous nations. So again, whether you're working with the Métis or the Inuit or other First Nations group, there may be a more appropriate option. Something we're exploring is the option of offering certain teas to groups and having a selection of what they would like to have offered beyond just the tobacco. And then, being very, again, cognizant and aware of sharing information on how those individuals can get access to those materials. So being direct with names, numbers, emails, who they need to contact directly. And then through dissemination, what we've seen or done in the past is then sharing that information directly with those who participated. So a copy of that work that was completed. And something I have seen in works done by other researchers is doing presentations in communities. So coming back and bringing that material that they talked about, but also doing it in a way where it's not just the final product they're seeing. They have that ability to come back and provide that option of adding more information, editing, ensuring that what is reflected in that final piece is appropriate and accurate.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I some of the work that I do really looks at the notion of international journalism, global journalism, as an ongoing form of colonialism, right? It's like, the idea that a journalist is going to come from here, going to go over there to go get their story, extract that information, turn around, package it back in the mothership and send it back out into the world, right? And I mean, if that's not, ongoing global colonialism, I don't know what is, right? So one of the things to do is come up with other models. And in the journalistic sense, I spoke about things in terms of archetypes and standards, but I know that that's not how I do it. I do ask people if they want to see questions beforehand. I do ask people how they feel that a story may be interesting to them. How might a story be useful for them? How can this work for you in what it is that you want, whether it's correcting a record, publicizing a situation, bringing an event to light, correct, again, correcting something in that sense. So that's something in terms of journalism, is I remind them of the limits of journalism, but also of the potential power of journalism. And then something really simple, I will send the clip, I will send the audio clip, I will cut it out of the newspaper and scan it over, because especially since I do a lot of work internationally, folks may not have that kind of access, or time zones might be very, very different. So that's one thing. The other thing, and I feel odd saying it in this way, but it's things that I have learned from my colleagues and friends who are Indigenous scholars, and that's having the 4 R's of Indigenous methodologies in terms of and ethics, in terms of respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. But then the 5th R that was added by Dr. Amy Parent of relationships. So again, the 4 R's coming from Crookness and Barnhart, and then the 5th R coming from Amy Parent. Respect, relevance, reciprocity, responsibility, and relationships. What is this interview doing? What is this research doing? Who is it benefiting? How is it benefiting? And how can we actually make it be useful, helpful, healthy in that sense? How can this make things better for not only this person, but for this person's story, community, truths, etc. And a really simple thing is just always ending the interview with the question, is there anything that you want to tell me that I didn't ask? Is there anything that you want to tell me is there anything you want to tell me that just that I didn't ask, or that you think I should know? That's usually how I say, that you think I should know. I do this in journalistic interviews as well, and often that's where a lot of the other stories come through. It's as they say in counseling, it's the doorknob moment. So when you're going to leave the counselor, right? You put your hand on the doorknob. Oh yeah, by the way, it's like that. And that question often will do it. That is a way of actually trying to break down some of that power and make it be generative as opposed to exploitative. I also give money. I should say, when it's when we're doing any sort of interviews that's involving anything but journalistic interviews. I don't give money for journalistic interviews. For academic interviews, I have no problem, giving a small token of appreciation for time, $25 for an interview, for an hour of time, something like that. That's absolutely fine. Other organizations will give more.
Misha, did you want to share some thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like I don't know if I have a ton more to add, but definitely thinking about the how do you kind of compensate, or like what do you kind of offer to someone who's kind of giving you so much of like their own, something that is kind of so intimate, sharing about their lives and that kind of thing. It always feels a bit, in a way, strange to give money for something like that, because it is like, well, how is this really kind of equivalent in some way? And I guess that's sort of not really the point. I think the biggest thing for my project and what I kind of learned from it is allowing, I guess, staying in touch with people, sending the kind of completed files to them, or sending the kind of what comes out of it to them, allowing them to kind of see kind of where their story goes and what sort of purposes it gets put to, and allowing them to kind of reach out and kind of stay connected in some kind of way if that's what they want to do. That's sort of, I guess, what my thoughts are at this point in terms of how to kind of offer something back to the people I'm hearing stories from, and not letting that become a kind of extractive thing.
Very much. If folks didn't see the chat, Kaila has shared a useful resource in terms of Indigenous research methodologies by Cindy Pelletier. Miigwech, Kaila. So I'm looking at the time here. I'm wondering, do we have any other questions from folks in the room? Again, you can type your question into the chat, or you can use the raise hand function. If not, I've got another, but I'm encouraging folks to ask their questions.
We want to
here.
hear from you. This is all about your truths and your words and stories, please.
Okay, so maybe then to close, something that has come up across everybody's sharing has been, I'm curious about what your experiences have been in terms of like challenges and opportunities that arise when you're doing research within your own communities, but also when you're doing research not in your own communities.
I can go in terms of this. I'm often doing research with folks who are not of my communities. And I often feel like I do that as a chicken way out. Because you know, I'll joke around and I'll say, if you know, I'm Jewish, and I'll say, like, if you ask a Jew, if you ask 3 Jews a question, you get 4 answers. You know, and oftentimes it's kind of like I almost feel like I know too much, and I know too much of the quagmires, and I know too much to do. I really, really want to go in there. However, the few times that I have done research with regarding you know, folks who identify as being Jewish, it's often actually to look at the discomfort that we have. And so it might, you know, it might be in terms of things like, you know, queer and faithful, or, you know, et cetera. Like, what are some of the things that where we are uncomfortable, and kind of starting, you know, from that point. When I'm doing, you know, research with communities that I'm not a part of, which is, you know, much of my work has been with you know, with the Roma communities, Gypsy communities, and I'm not Roma. I speak Romani, but I'm not Roma. One of the main things I do is I start off by acknowledging that I am not. When I have done interviews with folks who are torture survivors, I start off by saying I am not, and I know this. So, you know, and starting and kind of saying a little bit of who I am in that sense. Again, even as a journalist, this is common to do in many forms of critical academia. It is not common within journalism. The other thing is when I am doing interviews with journalists, which is a community I do find that I'm a part of. You know, or with other academics, I ask them to define where they are coming from, how they identify themselves as a journalist. What does a journalist mean to you? What does an academic mean to you? As opposed to assuming that because we are coming from the same community, that we're coming from the same positionality or the same perspective or the same idea. So giving that space for folks to be able to define their own terms, even when it is assumed that we are sharing.
Very much, Shayna. Kaila, looks like you've unmuted.
I did. I have a cat on me as well, so please, if you can hear her, please excuse her. I suppose it's interesting from my perspective, as I'm both researching in and outside of my own Indigenous communities. Now, when it's researching within my own First Nations communities, some challenges that have come up is we've been regarded, or I've not been regarded as Indigenous enough. I haven't suffered enough or experienced the same sort of traumas or harms. So it's a belief that I would not be able to understand or, you know, get a sense to be able to build that trust, that we are working with the government and the perpetrators. And so we're seen as an outside organization, even though we may be Indigenous. And the same can be said with, say, working with, for instance, myself going up north and working with Inuit communities and not being part of the Inuit community, although Indigenous, again, not understanding that scope or experience from the north. And so that has been a challenge that's cropped up again and again. And how we've kind of mitigated that or worked with that is, again, through that welcoming piece of getting a sense of, this is who I am, this is how I am related to this. And a really good example we have is one of our non-Indigenous statement gatherers. When she arrived in community, you know, first thing off of the bus, it was a survivor who wanted to know who she was, what they were doing there, and was very aggressive in doing so. And so it was having to kind of step back and, you know, just give that sense, whereas, you know, we understand the hesitancy, we understand that there may be challenges, but again, we're working in a very open and transparent way. This is how we want to go about doing this in a good way, as well as this is, again, how you can access that information, where that information is going to be and how it's going to be used. And the statement gatherer, she later told me that individual came up to her later on when they spent that full day in the community. They were there for 2 days. That second day, he came out after having spoken to other individuals who had given their statement, felt a little more secure in being able to approach and wanting to possibly give a statement of their own. So again, it's like that building that trust and rapport with that community, with the individuals you'll be working with. And so it's, we've seen some difficulties, but we've seen ways on how we're able to kind of build that trust up again and secure those, or ensure that those who wish to participate, that they are secure in participating, that they are safe.
Oh gosh. Misha?
Yeah, I guess my thoughts on this are, you know, when I'm interviewing other trans people, I'm very aware that there are parts of our experience that are shared maybe, or that we have a kind of common understanding, but there's also a lot that about us that is, you know, that is not the only part of ourselves that is informing what we're kind of talking about. And there are always going to be kind of limits of like what is sort of shared between us and what isn't, and kind of what we can sort of, or kind of what is sort of things that I might kind of know how to engage with going in. There might be limits to that, and that's kind of, I guess, good to kind of be upfront about and kind of aware, even if there's one part that is sort of shared, there are others that aren't necessarily, and that's okay, and that's kind of, but that's also a sort of thing to be kind of aware of. And particularly, I guess, just one experience that kind of in my researching that came up in, and kind of I kind of ended up talking through with an interviewee, is there's an interviewee who I ended up having a couple of different sessions talking with, and kind of developing an ongoing friendship with. And we had a really great interview, but it very kind of quickly showed up in the process of interviewing that there's definitely limits to what I could kind of, how I was able to come up with follow-up questions and whatnot, because this interviewee, a lot of his own trans experience was really kind of informed by his experience in the Orthodox Jewish community and his kind of the tensions and experiences with that. And I, as not a part of that community, was like, I don't know exactly how to follow up with different things. I can ask questions and kind of hear what he wants to say, but there was sort of some limits in some ways in our conversation. And what ended up happening is that he'd actually been interviewed by another person for a book that about trans people in Orthodox Judaism, and went really deep into kind of like talking about that with someone who was also from that community. So we, in our kind of interview, he offered to kind of contact the other interviewee and get us to actually kind of get that interview as a kind of supplement to go alongside the one I did with him, and have those kind of both archived together. And we ended up having a really great kind of process of kind of getting in touch with everyone and kind of being like, okay, these are sort of two different interviews that will sort of inform one another, but are very much touching on different kinds of things, and aren't kind of overlapping in a lot of ways, even while they're also speaking to each other. So I guess knowing that there's sort of some things that like some limits to what I was able to kind of connect with in the conversation or bring out, but that there was other sort of ways we could talk about what to do about that. In this case, supplementing the interview with another interview that had been done in another context and bringing those together was a way that kind of worked really well for this interviewee.
Miigwech, Misha. I'm just looking at time here. We're at time. I just want to say, Gitche miigwech, thank you so much to the panelists for sharing all their thoughtful insights about the limits and the power of these methods, and about how to avoid extractive research and instead, begin from a position of relationality. This is who I am, where I come from, why I'm here, and how to make space to honor people's agency. And the importance of remembering that these relationships can and may and maybe should persist even after the project is done. So at this point, I'll pass it back to Shayna. I think she wants to say a few words.
Many thanks, Chantal. Thank you for bringing us together, weaving us, together. Kaila, Misha. It feels very odd, in virtual time to not actually know you in person. I mean, Kaila, I had a chance to meet you really briefly, but I do hope to be able to have that opportunity at some point. I want to thank all of you who came today. I hope that this was, informative, thought-provoking. I hope you disagree with us and you let us know, or I hope you agree with us and you let us know, or I hope you just kind of chew it over, a bit and see, what works for you in that sense. It'll be alive on our website at the Center for Human Rights Research. It'll be under events and under past events, so the video will be there fairly soon. And it'll also be available maybe if folks want to use it if you're in a class or something like that. In that sense. I want to remind you, March 10th, we're having a workshop at 7:30 p.m. called Working with Journalists. So when people who are doing human rights research, when they're working with journalists, then what is it that the journalist is looking for, but also what a journal, so how can a researcher work with a journalist, and how can a journalist work with a researcher? They are different cultures, in a sense. In May, again, the data is going to be finalized. We're going to be doing artistic methods of human rights. We're really hoping that can be in person. All of these will be free. All of these are available to you. And as this is part of a session looking at stories and looking at words and looking at truths, I really just want to say thank you for sharing your truths, Kaila, Misha, Chantal, and the audience.